All Fords are exactly alike, but no two men are just alike. Every new life is a new thing under the sun. There has never been anything just like it before, never will be again. A young man ought to get that idea about himself. He should look for the single spark of individuality that makes him different from the other folks and develop that for all he is worth. Society and schools may try to iron it out of him. Their tendency is to put it all in the same mold. But I say don't let that spark be lost. It is your only real claim to importance. Henry Ford. The role of education and its evolution is a debated topic, but it is apparent that the economy has its place in influencing its movement, in both the past and in the present. Henry Ford's innovations in 1913 in relation to the efficiency of the automobile assembly line sparked the interest of educational institutions everywhere. The benefit of introducing the concept of the assembly line into schools was wholly realized. In following years, students would be organized in a manner similar to maximize the economic efficiency of schooling. Economy has rooted itself in education in multiple ways, including that example and the following examples of textbooks and tuition.
In Canada, tuition fees are currently the highest they have ever been, and costs for students continue to rise. Between 1990 and 2014, the national average of tuition fees has increased by 155%. Tuition fees can be a financial barrier to higher education. Particular groups, including those with low socioeconomic status, racialized communities, and single-parent households, are likely to be excluded. For those who do opt for financial support, tuition fees can cause students to incur large amounts of debt. The outstanding debt to the Canada Student Loans Program alone is around $16 billion, which represents a significant strain on Canada's economy. Students with Canada Student Loans now graduate with an average debt of over $28,000. Unfortunately, the cost of tuition fees is not a problem that will soon go away for Canadian students. The federal government predicts that the cost of education will increase for the next 25 years. How did we get here? To find out, we must examine our past. The history of the economy of tuition in Canada has not been a straight line. The sources of college and university funding in Canada have changed many times. Throughout the years, colleges and universities in Canada have been funded privately by the tuition fees of the elite, by denominational church organizations, by the federal government, and by provincial governments, often guided by disputes about what the role of each organization should be in the financial matters of education. The first colleges in the British colonies that would later become Canada were established in Nova Scotia in 1789 and New Brunswick in 1800. McGill College in Montreal appeared in 1821. In the 1840s, a number of colleges popped up that were directly associated with particular denominational church organizations. These colleges, funded by church organizations, became the most popular model for higher education. In 1867, the British North America Act created the Dominion of Canada, Canada somewhat now as we know it, which established two levels of government, federal and provincial. Responsibility for particular areas of policy was assigned to either the federal or provincial government. The role of education was assigned to the provinces. Yet for many years, various types of institutions for higher education remained. There were public, private, secular, and denominational institutions. The relationships between the government and these various types of institutions were unclear. Despite the fact that the provincial governments were supposed to have authority over matters of education in Canada, there were no hard and fast rules for how provincial governments should deal with the financial matters of non-secular and private institutions. There were often disputes about what the government's involvement should be in the funding of Canadian higher education. These disputes came to a head when Ontario's government was accused of political interference in matters of higher education. The need to disentangle universities from political power became clear. In 1906, the Flavel Commission report concluded, "We have examined the governmental systems of other state universities upon this continent and have found a surprising unanimity of the view upon the propriety of divorcing them from the direct superintendence of political powers." The report established a model of governance of Canadian universities, which mirrored the models used in the United States. Universities now had their own systems of government and had significant autonomy from the Canadian government. This model was quickly adopted all across Canada, and each province, recognizing the need to separate themselves from the church institutions, created provincial universities. Prior to World War II, given the small number of universities in Canada and the small number of people who attended them, Universities received little attention and little financial support from the government. These early Canadian universities were intended to serve the political elite, those who could pay the substantial tuition fees. Following World War II, the public perception of universities began to change, and so did their funding. Veterans were eligible to receive a free university education as part of their reintegration program. Both their tuition fees and living costs would be covered by the federal government. In 1945, 20,000 veterans entered the higher education system. Interest in university education spiked. Between 1941 and 1951, there was a 70% increase in university enrollment, even without considering the veterans' enrollment. In response, in 1951, the federal government allocated $7 million in educational grants. In 1956, in a national conference on the crisis in higher education, the federal government announced funding to provide for the increasing rise in enrollment in universities. The expanded federal support was great for students, but caused disagreement about constitutional issues between the federal and provincial governments. Fed up with the federal government's interference, Quebec even tried to advise its universities to refuse federal funding in 1952. Over the next 15 years, the federal government eventually shifted its financial contributions from direct grants to schools toward financial contributions to the provinces, giving the provinces and individual universities greater autonomy. But the economic recession slowed federal financial contributions to education in 1970, and the provinces became burdened by the increasing costs of public health care. Federal cuts of $4.5 billion were made to the provinces between 1977 and 1995. Accordingly, the provinces reduced post-secondary contributions, and tuition fees increased enormously in most provinces.
Compared to the 90s, the tuition fees have increased by threefold. The average Canadian university tuition fee, which has been $1,464, has now risen to $5,581. Not only for the higher education, but also the tuition fees for all levels of education is rising. The daycare fees for preschoolers range from $300 to $45,000, and the difference keeps getting larger. Especially with the education boom all around the world, donations from big corporations are not helping. As parents start to seek brands even for education, tuition fees for schools funded by big corporations seems to be on a constant rise, along with the idea that more expensive something is, the better quality it offers. All these changes in the tuition fees and the corporation's clear influence on those changes is clearly reflected in various companies, one of them being Samsung. Starting to fund for various institutions in 2004, Samsung has constantly increased its donations. However, it has caused parents in Korea to pay over $1,500 per term for their preschool children when the average daycare fee is only $300. Thus, for parents who are only paid the minimum wage of $6.29, they are left with a feeling of incompetence to provide for their children. Not only the lower levels of education, but also higher levels of education are also suffering consequences from these donations as well. Sungkyunkwan University, one of Korea's most prestigious universities, is known to be getting over 50 billion of donations from Samsung every year. For the students attending the university, the funding opens the door to all possible opportunities, whereas for everyone else, it is a complete nightmare. Not only are they faced with less opportunities for scholarships, but also with the more cruel reality of having to find a job. As a result, it becomes a recurring cycle, as parents pay more and more money to possibly broaden the opportunity for their children to enroll in one of the most prestigious universities, while all the money goes back into the corporation's pockets, along with the newly attained title as being caring for the public's concern. Yet, even with all these concerns for the increase in tuition fees, the influence of big corporations are still quite surprising when only 0.1% of profits of very few companies are known to be investing in our education system.
In general, tuition rates have been increasing over the years and continue to do so today. Although many countries still have tuition fees for attending universities and colleges, Germany is a country which has abolished tuition fees completely. In Germany, tuition fees are viewed as unfair and unjust. Gabriel Heinenkajak, the Minister for Science and Culture in Lower Saxony, states, "We got rid of tuition fees because we do not want higher education which depends on the wealth of the parents." Additionally, free education is something that is embraced in the country and as well as many other parts of Europe. The abolishment of tuition fees in Germany aims to spread the message that education should be available for everyone regardless of their income levels. Hamburg Senator for Science, Dorothy Stapelfeld, suggests that tuition fees discourage many young individuals who don't have a family background in academia. Stapelfeld implies that individuals in Germany should study at a high-quality standard, free of charge. With Germany as a leading example, hopefully one day tuition fees will be abolished in all countries, making education available to all. In the economy of education, no more prevalent an issue affects students than the pricing of textbooks. This issue is probably familiar to the majority of you, especially when recollecting the cost of your textbooks this semester. As it stands, textbook costs have risen by 2.44 times the rate of inflation since 2008, according to the Canadian Federation of Students. Which begs the following question: why are textbook costs so high? The reality is that the textbook market is a defective one, which does not promise protection over its prices for students. In a traditional market, competition would force everyone's prices down and high pricing would repel consumers from purchasing the product. In the textbook market, however, there is a lack of competition and the consumer, in this case categorized as a student, is not the one deciding which product to purchase and rather the professor, with no inclination to choose a textbook priced fairly, chooses what product is purchased by the consumers. Now, before you go out and start beating your professors with your overpriced textbooks, it's important to realize that the problem is not entirely with them, but within the system itself. To get a better idea of why this is, we need to go back in time to when the textbook came into being. While claims can be made that the textbook's origin could have been rooted in multiple places like the 16th century in the form of language learning textbooks, the best claim is that John Amos Comenius created a foundation of the concept of the textbook in the 17th century. Comenius made the first attempt at creating books which would adhere directly to the education of students. Comenius's Orbit Pictus was made with the intention of exposing photos of the world to children, who learned by observing objects rather than listening to descriptions of them. This book was revolutionary in the sense that it was specifically made to improve the way children learned. For the first time, a book was made to fit the child, and the child was not made to fit the book. This textbook was widely used by children for 200 years. Textbooks were used as memorization tools in 19th century America, where the same book was simply used for all grade levels. Around this time, public authorities began to distribute textbooks free of cost, first occurring in Philadelphia in 1818. In 1900, a dozen states distributed free school texts, and the trend only continued in growth in 1949, when a whopping 36 states distributed free school texts. These textbooks being distributed in the 1930s and onwards were cheap and reused for decades. Publishers prided themselves on the durability and longevity of their products. In 1960, data compiled on undergraduate school costs revealed that books and equipment averaged $75 for a single student. These textbooks being distributed in the 1930s and onwards were cheap and were reused for decades. Publishers prided themselves on the durability and longevity of their products. In 1960, data compiled on undergraduate school costs revealed that books and equipment averaged $75 for a single student. However, shifting gears almost 30 years later, data compiled in 1988 indicates that textbook costs had reached $400 on average for a student, only continued to climb afterwards. Which begs the question, what happened? The reasons for these changes in cost came from a change in attitudes which began after World War II had ended. The universal acceptance of basic education had begun. This change in attitudes sparked the interest of the World Bank, and in 1970 they sponsored analytic work to be done on the topic of textbooks. What did they find out? Well, they found out a couple of very curious things. The first being that textbook availability was the single most consistent correlate of academic achievement in developing countries. This meant that textbooks would be in high demand when the role of educational reforms all over the globe would kickstart. The second discovery, a very crucial discovery, was that textbook supply is analogous to that of other manufactured products in that quality, efficiency, and price was a function of the private as opposed to public sources. What this meant for the World Bank was that they could justify their investment into the textbook market because it was a legitimate business opportunity. There was a profit to be made, and we can see this profit exemplified on the graphs showing the increase of textbook prices over the years. You see, while consumer prices have gone up 5-fold their original prices from 1970, textbook prices themselves have gone up 15-fold their prices since 1970. Other data compiled reveals that there has been an 812% increase in textbooks beginning from 1978 to 2012, and this increase in percentage is wildly higher than the increase in percentage for inflation, which only caps out at about 250%.
Our conclusion is that the economy of education has unfolded in cascading motions, strangling students and educators alike. Moving forward from this, if we intend to improve our environment of education in any way, we must continue to be cognizant of the presence of capitalism in our schools. Education is not a race with winners and losers. It's not a commodity to be bought and sold. Grace Llewellyn and Amy Silver.